I want to discuss a couple of things which have been happening in the past few days. One is the Karnataka Minister Priyank Kharge making this assertion that RSS activities should be banned in government properties. He's saying, why should they do their marches in schools and colleges? That's one thing which is happening in Karnataka. Parallelly, we have been seeing the VHP sort of announcing that they want to build the campaign of Free Temple Movement. They had something going on in September. So a lot of small developments happening as far as the RSS, VHP, etc. go. Of course, the RSS just celebrated its 100th year. So Geeta, have you been following what's happening in Karnataka? Because Siddaramaiah has said that he wants to follow Tamil Nadu model. And Tamil Nadu for many years had not been allowing marches till the 2022-23 case happened, which went to the Supreme Court itself.
Well, Tamil Nadu may not have allowed RSS or Hindutva-supported marches in government spaces, but the rationalist and the more critical rationalist and radical segments of the Dravidian movement have always wondered, why do they allow Hindu festival celebrations on government property? For instance, Ayudha Puja celebrations in almost every government office, factory, and so on. The reason I bring this up is that there's a certain level of everyday religiosity that the BJP is counting on. And they're just waiting for that right combination of, political tension and the moment at hand in which this fairly routine everyday religiosity can be pushed one notch higher and made to serve their purpose. So I think the outrage we feel when the RSS and VHP do stuff on government property, it should also be matched by what else happens on government property without the RSS and VHP. Because government property is secular and Sarkar space, as it's called. Sarkar space should remain Sarkar space. Or we should all admit our Sarkar allows religious festivals of all kinds, and we must have other reasons for telling the VHP not to do this. So I would like to complicate this discussion a little bit, rather than sort of only see it as a sort of a Hindutva assertion, because then we play right into their hands and fight the battle on their terms. But it's good to also take a hard look at oneself and see what conditions have been created over the decades that it's easier for the Hindu right to sort of brazenly do this sort of thing.
But can we compare an RSS march to religious event? Like Anisha had talked to the DCP, I think, in Bengaluru, and he also said the same thing, right? That we are allowing religious events now, and so RSS march also was allowed.
Actually, I spoke to an activist who told me that, when he questioned the DCP told him that they had permitted the route marches, and just like they permit any other, so there's a High Court order context to this where a pride march was, went to court and said that, okay, we are not protesting, we are creating sensitization on LGBTQ rights. And that's when the High Court said that, okay, if it's not a protest, then you can have a meeting in a public place, which is outside the designated protest area of Bangalore, which is Freedom Park. So in that context, I think that was what the police officer was talking about when he said that, we allow it just like we allow religious marches and, So
can an RSS march be compared to a religious event in a government organization, in a government building?
No, I don't mean to compare the two. I don't think there's any real analogy there. But I do think it's good for us if you're fighting the Hindutva forces in real earnest. And this is a long battle. It's not going to end tomorrow or the day after, right? Let's also sort of build our resources in a way that allows us to take stock of what we've been doing so far, what should we do going ahead. And if we can be a little more reflexive in some of these cases, because there's no point in reacting immediately to what they're doing, because that's what they want, right? They want us to provoke them into being even more aggressive. So I think that's very important, that how do we build our resources in such a way that we can also make it very evident why are we challenging them, whereas we will allow an LGBT person to occupy government space and say whatever the organization wishes to say. But we need to build a strategy and a culture for doing that, don't we? So I would actually, I'm basically a historian and a teacher. So I think in pedagogic and historic terms, rather than in terms of, what one ought to do immediately. This is not to say one ought not to do anything immediately. And I'm certain that if something like that happens in Tamil Nadu, there will be protests and people will go to court. And I I don't think there's anything wrong in any of that. But if you ask me, I think we should ask ourselves some tough questions as well. Those of us who purportedly are on the liberal, secular, left side of politics.
So in Karnataka, irrespective of who is in power, when government projects get inaugurated, one Brahmin will be called, one coconut will be broken. That is generally the process. And it's not even a non-Brahmin priest. It will invariably be some agama ritual of so-called Bhumi Puja or something like that will happen. Is that the case in Tamil Nadu? And once you answer, I have some supplementary questions. But is that how it works in Tamil Nadu as well?
Yeah, I don't think it's as blatant as that. For example, when we open the Mettur Dam every year, to let water from Karnataka flow into Tamil Nadu, which is such a big occasion for us, we have engineers and even the minister throwing flowers into the water. I haven't seen any Brahmin priest on such occasions. When government projects are inaugurated, I must confess, I haven't seen such pictures put out into the media or any place else. And I suspect that they may not call a Brahmin. But it's possible that some individual ministers might actually sort of consent to some kind of a puja, not necessarily involving a Brahmin.
Okay. No, in say if it happens in Karnataka, it's not like that's the photo op. That ritual happens for the satisfaction of everybody. The photo op will be the chief minister or principal secretary, whoever is inaugurating. That's separate. But anyway, the supplementary that I had is, ma'am, how do you look at public spaces also is a question, right? I mean, if you consider that in Tamil Nadu, the government has been very proactive in banning the RSS and Hindutva organizations from government schools. And let's also look at which are the public spaces that these organizations want to occupy. They're mostly looking at educational institutions, colleges, schools, Anganwadis. These are the places they want to operate out of. And even, let's say, playgrounds attached to these facilities. Now, while they've been banned over there, one of the things that I picked up in some of my previous reporting assignments is that in the private school circuit, they've become very, very big. And there, it is assumed that there should be no government oversight. But tell me, correct me, and Dhanya, you should speak over here. You've covered education for many years, Anisha also. Education is a state subject in that, yes, you might have a private management. But what you impart by way of education is very much under state control. So if you have RSS influencers coming into a private school also, is it a problem of the state government or is it not? I don't know.
The RSS, of course, wants to take hold of educational spaces. That's very evident. You see that already happening in, say, a place like Pondicherry University, which shocks a lot of people who've never taught elsewhere in the South. And they suddenly come to Pondicherry and it's quite a shock to them to see the kind of saffronization that has happened in a very visible sense. So that's very evident what their project is. Now, in the Tamil Nadu context, what's interesting is private institutions, both institutions of higher education as well as schools, have for long been under the control of particular kinds of denominational bubbles. So if you take the well-known CBSE schools in Chennai city, for example, say Padma Seshadri, for instance, which was a go-to for a lot of upper caste kids through the 70s and 80s and so on, till they also realized the demographic pressure and now they have a broader cohort of children from various communities. But the point is that they are not going to give up their obviously Brahmanical Hindu ways of functioning in terms of what prayers they have, the kinds of inputs that they give kids in a cultural sense. Not that they would do it in an obvious sort of way. So these spaces, even if the RSS doesn't directly have to do anything with them, you can have somebody who's associated with that institution in some manner, who spouts in public all kinds of opinions which are dear to Hindutva. So that's also a way in which they are functioning in Tamil Nadu. You see that very clearly. So you see people associated with the educational institutions coming out with something even as terrible as a defense of untouchability. In some ways, you see that happening. And you also see fellows who head higher institutions, like the SRM set of institutions, engineering, medical colleges, and so on. So Parivendran is quite happy to invite right-wing persons to various kinds of functions that they do and so on. So, and very interestingly, many of these are, as I said, denominational groups, either of a religious or a caste kind. And many of these castes are not numerous in terms of numbers. They are not like, say, the Bokul Gors, they are not like the Vanyars, they are not like the Gaundars, but they are powerful propertied castes. They could be Udayars, for instance, they could be Naidus, they could be Reddiyars, and the BJP has made it its special agenda to actually train its attention on these kinds of caste groups as well. And their propertied and their fairly sort of banal political interest is served well by audience. And you see that happening already in private spaces. And the government can regulate. Will the government regulate? Because the government also has other kinds of equations with these institutions. I mean, there's a long history to the privatization of education in all our states. And in Tamil Nadu, it goes back to MJR's period. And many of those who started institutions were from his party at that time. And then subsequently, the DMK did the same. Then the Congress did the same. Everyone except the communist has educational institutions. I mean, the parties that are invested in propaganda don't have educational resources, of a kind that, that would build a different kind of common sense. But the parties who are very determined to sort of push their point of view all do this kind of a thing. So government is also going to really tread on very fine territory here where the private institutes are concerned. Because I think there are lots of overlapping interests that hold them together. And this I would like to say also, like in Tamil Nadu, for example, Karnataka has already seen BJP rule, so there's also that distinct difference. But Tamil Nadu has seen the reign of J. Jayalalitha. And we mustn't forget those years. Those years were the most authoritarian years in the history of Tamil Nadu. The different segments of time that she served as chief minister of the state, you will see how she systematically crippled all democratic institutions, including the media. I still remember the time when KP Sunil of the week was in the eye of a storm for having written something very critical about her. Then the government hit back, and over a period of time, Sunil found himself landing a job in Jaya TV. So, I mean, it's a very interesting sort of approach that she had, not very dissimilar to what we see happening around us today. And never forget the time when these very important set of scholars from Sri Lanka had come for the World Tamil Conference, including Professor Sivathambi, who was a doyen of Tamil literary history. And they were all unceremoniously sent for various reasons. And I mean, I can quote so many things that point how every feature that you see that is part of the way the government at the center functions today, in muzzling speech, in cracking down on dissent, in defining what is legit and what is not legit, all of these have precedence in Jayalalitha ruled Tamil Nadu, in NTL ruled Andhra Pradesh, Telangana in the past. Why I'm saying this is, fascism need not always come allied with an ideology. It has two aspects, right? Hindutva has two aspects. One is an authoritarian state apparatus, which goes all the way down, which is seen as a good thing by sections of the population. And then an ideology which wants to draw more and more people into this consensus. Now, in Tamil Nadu, you may not have the ideology, but you have the constituents of an authoritarian state, which had been put in place by Jayalalitha during her several years of rule in the state. And I don't think the DMK has rolled back those measures fully. And in some ways, they have layered them with a veneer of democratic practice. In some instances, they have sort of not worked with those constituents. I mean, their attitude towards the media, it's still relatively more open than in most parts of the country. But the fact is that you have these authoritarian resources at hand, should you want to use them. And where that intersects with Hindutva would be what we're thinking about. But it can also exist without Hindutva, for instance.
I just want to drag this back also into the question in hand about when all of you are discussing about the use of private space and public space for the RSS activities. And we have to divide the RSS activities as to, they use a playground, for example, for kabaddi and sports and all that thing. And they have their prayer, from Shishu, Bal, Tarun, Proud, everybody stands and does their prayers. But in Karnataka, what is being opposed is also the marches. Now, what Priyank is saying is that using the lathi and walking on the streets, using the lathi inside schools, what is the message that you send? Now, Hegdewar or Golwalkar or whoever, it's very clear from their writings that they thought it's about community, it's about Hindu nation, it's about being the aggressor also in one way, which is why, we have spoken a lot about how it's inspired from British police or Boy Scout and so many other things. But the discussion is also about the language of what they're doing, right? Of the lathi in a school, in a government space.
Yeah, and also a lathi in a public space, right? It can be a weapon, is what activists on the ground in Karnataka are saying, and Bangalore especially, because you're not allowed to hold protest marches anywhere, but RSS is allowed to hold a march with the lathi. So they're like, okay, fine, you allowed a procession, okay, they're not protesting, fine, but what about the lathi? Right? Where does that fit into your logic as a police officer? Does that not become a weapon?
Can I share an anecdote about a lathi? and I think it connects three things: Tamil Nadu, Silambam, and RSS. Okay, so I went for my Madurai fieldwork story, right? So final that one character was missing, which you know about. So I found that character, was very happy. So I went shopping in that small town and I found these Silambam sticks. Okay, so I picked up one Silambam stick from there, came all the way to Bangalore, got off at the Majestic bus stop, took a metro. The moment they saw me, they were like, "How can you take this? This is a weapon. This is a weapon." And I'm sorry to say this, but I just pretend, I didn't say too much, but I just pretended to be Sangha the Karyakarta. Okay. And they let me ride into the metro. Happily, I rode with a lathi riding on my shoulder like that. And
Yeah. Okay, since we are on this trip,
but Danya, do consider what it shows. It shows there's a certain common fear that has already crept in. That a guy who could be a clown, who could be a Sangha Karyakarta, whatever, carrying a stick can just invoke that name and will be allowed inside a metro station with a weapon, which could have been used to crack somebody's head.
yeah, and coincidentally, a few days ago, I fought with some metro staff over a balloon that a friend had. Okay, because a balloon is considered a weapon according to metro rules. I filed an official complaint and they got back to me, said, "No, you can't carry balloon because this is a weapon. Complaint closed. Bye bye."
But on the suspicion that I might be a Karyakarta, I'm allowed to carry a stick.
Yes.
On the suspicion, yeah.
But can I quickly, I use that Silambam example.
I think there is a certain acceptance in perhaps central government institutions across the state of this kind of a behavior. In Tamil Nadu state, I think there has been a general sort of critical common sense that we won't let this happen in our part of the world. And if Karnataka thinks that's a good example, that's great. But I'm also concerned about the fact that there are other ways in which the BJP, RSS, the Hindutva Sangh family is making its presence felt. I'm not sort of being alarmist here. I'm just saying that they work with a eye towards a very long term, and is as important to take note of these other ways in which they are infiltrating, so to speak. We won't allow RSS marches. Of that, I'm very sure. They're also going to protest if they come into our state government schools and start doing things, and that's not going to be sort of countenanced at all. But for every set of teachers that supports, say, the Dravidian idea, who's opposed to this kind of a Hindutva thing, who's secular in the sense that most people understand the word, there are perhaps many who think that we're making a lot of fuss. It's okay to be Hindu. So what is the RSS saying that's so terrible? We don't know those people so well because they're not part of our social circle. But there are plenty of them that are there out there, and the BJP is banking on them. And it's going to sort of work in ways that you can get to them, can reach them. I'm not saying that they'll be successful or that they will be actually part of the BJP consensus. But I think their success also is they're tailoring their approach to very local situations, aren't they? I don't know, we all had a chance to look at that interview with RSS that was published in Outlook. And I found it hilarious in some ways because it's such a copybook question answer session. And all these kinds of things that the BJP RSS find problematic about Tamil Nadu, that script is at least 50 years old or 60 years old. It goes back to the 1970s, if not earlier, when there was no BJP as such, but you had a Hindu right wing, Jansangh and so on and so forth. So I think they are still a bit clueless about how to deal with Tamil Nadu. So they're trying very hard and working with spaces that are already available to them one way or the other. But having said that, their model, which might perhaps work in some other parts of the country, are not quite going to work here. Many months ago, I wrote a piece for a seminar called No Place for a National Religion. Basically, my argument was it's not that the Tamils are irreligious. Anyone who comes to Tamil Nadu knows that's not true. Look at the number of temple towers per square kilometer. So, but the religiosity that Tamils practice have a lot to do with their sense of place, where they are from and what does that matter to them. And their caste has a very important role to play. But caste plays a role that's not quite mappable onto the communal agenda in a straightforward way. It can be made to happen, but it doesn't immediately happen. So you'll have folks doing stuff with their temples that they claim are community practices. Dalits will be kept out or sometimes might be accepted or allowed on an unequal basis. But that does not immediately lend itself to a communal agenda unless there's a program to make it so. And that program is built assiduously over a period of time. And I think that sense of place is what the government of Tamil Nadu is banking on, and which it tries to define using the term Dravidian, I don't know if that captures everything, but there's a sense of place which is very historical, which is particular. I think that's important. Even if you look at the temples, all those goddesses you go see in those temples, long ago, I forget which, Kamala Ganesh, the sociologist, wrote a very interesting essay, basically saying, why are these women, why do they have their own shrines? All these goddesses. I mean, they're there with their consort. I mean, they're like this happy family photo, no, man, wife, child, and all that. So, and then you also have these women sitting in their own state. And you'll always see that these women are very local. They're very local names, very Tamil names. And then they're wedded to Vishnu or Shiva or whomever. And then in that wedded aspect, they have a Sanskritized name. So it's quite interesting how a sense of place also maps onto a sense of gender. And the Tamilians have worked out a very complicated equation with Brahmanical Hinduism. I don't think the RSS has got really into its head because it's so brutal and in its patterning out identities. It doesn't quite get this long historical battle with the Brahmanical Hinduism. And then there is, of course, a whole question of Dalit religiosity, which neither the regular non-Brahmanical Hindus are able to sort of work with, nor the RSS. RSS does, of course, work with Anganwadis. You brought it up earlier in Karnataka. So there's a study of the BJP RSS work in Western Tamil Nadu and Southern Tamil Nadu by this scholar from HCU, Arun Kumar, who's done his PhD on the RSS working in these two parts of the state. And he actually had some very interesting things to say. Who are they working with in Western Tamil Nadu? What are the spaces they occupied? Anganwadis is one. After school centers are another. So they do have that strategy and they work with particular social groups in those spaces. In this case, the Arundatiyars. So it's, one needs to really sort of look closely at what they are doing, where it works in a caste sense, where it doesn't work in a religious sense, where they're trying to make things work. So I won't be sanguine like the rest of my Dravidian counterparts and say it'll never happen in Periyar's land. That's not true. It can happen anywhere because there is a basis for authoritarian rule everywhere in India. And very happily, there are folks here who will compromise with anything to occupy those spaces. They don't have to particularly believe in Hindutva ideology to do that. You think Edappadi Palaniswamy believes in that ideology? Does he care? He doesn't. But he's such a astute political opportunist. He'll do what he wants to do with the BJP.
So like she was saying, that the sense of place which Tamil Nadu has used, in Karnataka, is that even possible? I know that this Priyank is saying this, Siddaramaiah is saying, I will look at a Tamil Nadu model. But the BJP and the Sangh is too strong here for them to actually take a decision, I feel. Remember in the manifesto, one of the big points of discussion was the Congress saying that we will look at banning the Bajrang Dal and the VHP, I think. Bajrang Dal, yeah. And it became a huge discussion point at that time. All the channels were going berserk over that. So when here is a place where they're very strong, cadre-wise, everything, they're in the government, they have been in the government. So how is it even possible?
No, it's not. Okay. I have said this only and I've said that they're very strong and all that, but it is just as easy to say the exact opposite. And Anisha and I have worked together in Mangalore. If you consider the strongest Sangh leader in somebody who's a stormtrooper kind of a Sanghi, who can get people on the ground, max can get 100 people, 200 people, which is the same capacity as a lefty. Okay, so whose example am I giving? Some Sharan Pampel, let's say. When he does a vigilante attack, it may become national news and all of that. But how many men are there? 40? 50? 100? Okay, so 100 men can take a district and a state and hold it to ransom is one aspect of this reality, which is that they have a very motivated critical minority in every place. Okay, we're looking at the growth of, Anisha just come back from her reporting in Maddur, where she's looking at the growth of the Sangh as a result of the JDS, BJP combine and all of that. And here we have an interesting character called Puneet Kerehalli, who's a vigilante who goes around attacking people for cow slaughter, vagera. How many people does he have? 10, 15, 100? No, he doesn't even have 50 people. So therefore, you have a small bunch of stormtroopers and you have, for the lack of a better word, I think the best way to describe them is these bought armies, right? We know how these are manufactured, how these opinions can be, AI can be used to just create this thing. And then the media channels we are talking about, we know where their money comes from and all that. So therefore, it could also be a cat arching its back and not as much of a...
No, so are you trying to say that if Siddaramaiah does push the envelope, he can go ahead and
absolutely say... See, but the Bajrang Dal does not... the Bajrang Dal does it have cadre of 1 lakh people?
No, I'm talking about RSS marches, not the Bajrang Dal here.
No. So
him restricting the RSS marches completely.
RSS is a bunch of not very fit men who are not stormtroopers they're mostly the Brahmins. Bajrang Dal's caste character, class character is completely different from those uncles you saw day before yesterday walking on the
But
streets.
the RSS also has the BJP here in Karnataka.
The BJP is a kind of like a bee which comes on a flowering plant.
But they will protest,
Okay,
right?
but they will.
And let's not forget what the, in all the discussion, because we brought the word secularism, Hindutva, the Supreme Court and the Madras High Court, while allowing the RSS marches in Tamil Nadu, High Court, in fact, Justice G. Jayachandran said that route marches not being allowed is certainly not in tune with secular or democratic way of governance, and it is contrary to the principle of secularism.
So, contrary to the
very, very
Principle of
convenient.
secularism,
Okay.
not allowing it.
Right. Okay, I'm not going to go into that, but taking off from what Sudipta was saying, I think I agree partly with him, but also partly disagree because, see, what he's saying about the stormtroopers, I think is true. And the violence in coastal Karnataka, at least, which is the bastion of the Sangh in Karnataka, the violence has come down. But it is also an ideologically captured place for them. You will have, and I think I've said this before also, you can have a public stadium full of 3,000, 5,000 people, family gathering type of scene, where some 18-year-old sadhvi can come and say, behead somebody if they look at your mothers and daughters. And this is in Shuddh Sanskritized Hindi, which nobody in that place even understands properly, but they cheered like it was a cricket match. Okay, so that ideological base is there, and it's there across classes, I think. But you still have the same people re-electing the Congress from time to time.
In
No,
that
but
region
I
only.
think
In
that
that
the-
region
in that
only,
region only.
and also
Al-
across the
also,
state.
then-
And also across
I
the
just
state.
want to say one more thing. The Banu Mushtaq
Yeah.
calling her to Dasara, right? Me and Pooja had a lot of arguments around it. But one thing we finally agreed is that it's like a balloon Siddaramaiah tried to, whatever. Like basically, there's nobody else who would have done it, right? Like call Banu Mushtaq, create this controversy and then just stand firm. So you can never say he's capable of doing this also, saying no RSS marches in public.
He's also capable of still giving us goosebumps. Siddaramaiah has made many mistakes in his career, but he's one of the last secular, socialist, progressive, anti-caste leaders in this part of the world. And hats off for what he did in that Dasara. Although that Banu Mushtaq imagery itself was problematic in its own way. We don't want to pull at that. But yeah, and time after time, we are seeing him getting isolated in that cabinet, which is full of right-wing people. We see, I suppose, Siddaramaiah and Priyank Kharge are the two people who keep getting exposed for their progressive ideology because they suddenly seem like the only people talking about these issues in this particular cabinet.
So I also want to talk about one more thing that the Siddaramaiah government did this time round in power, which is the reading of the preamble across schools and colleges. It was this huge chain of public, like people occupying the streets, saying preamble of the Constitution and reading that. Now, I don't know how much of that is going to trickle down into public consciousness, but even in terms of, say, this thing happening, right? At least it has the potential to plant an idea in people's heads. Whether that will take root or not is a different matter altogether, but I think this is something we need to talk about because as a public program, having kids read that, I think is a good idea. How much people do of explaining what the Constitution means, what the preamble means, what respect, dignity, equality, fraternity, all of that means, I suppose, as a civil society, we might have to build on that.
I want to come to you, Geeta ma'am. So when I started, I was also talking about how they keep rechurning the same ideas, right? Like the VHP says they'll do a fresh campaign on freeing temples. In Karnataka, when Basavaraj Bommai was a chief minister, he said the same thing. And they did try to bring a bill, but nothing happened further. Even when they're in power, it is just words and rhetoric. It never really happens. But it's going back to the same ideas, right? Like one enemy or two enemies, and then how to strengthen your community. It's just always the same thing, I feel.
It is. You see, that's also the limitations of the fascist script, isn't it? I mean, constant repetition supported by menace and violence. And the fact that you can't allow anything fresh to come in because that means then you're taking account of historical developments and changes. And don't forget one very important statement made by the great D.D. Kosambi. He said, caste is the opponent of history. He does not want to admit of historical change and historical movement. And he has this very entertaining story about how Satyapir became Satyanarayana. who's worshipped widely in the Deccan. It is a very engaging story where he says in the Deccan, Satyapir was like what's his name? Sai Baba, a fakir, a Muslim fakir, who was perhaps a healer of some kind, who was very popular. And then people went to him for various things. And then these are Kaushambi's words. Then he says, along comes some enterprising Brahmin, who then builds up this entire narrative about how this man is an avatar of Vishnu and therefore he's got all these gifts and skills. And over the time, the story of a fairly sort of localized fakir with some miraculous healing powers becomes aligned with a larger Hindu narrative. And Kaushambi uses this incident to talk about how they don't want you to even think of movement in history. They want to recoup everything within a familiar text. And this is something Ambedkar also points out in the Riddles of Hinduism. So there's a way in which they read time, and that's very important for us to understand. Time is for them seriously not something that moves. Time is something that brings you back to the same point again and again. And that's something that you see if you look at any of their issues, whether it's love jihad, for example. That was 3 years ago, that was in the news. Whether it is the whole question about the holy cow, there is that. Or whether it is about how actually Sanatana Dharma is very accommodative and Dalits need not fear anything. None of this is new. All of this goes back to the early 20th century. It was voiced by the Arya Samaj, it was voiced by the Hindu Mahasabha, it was voiced by a range of Hindu thinkers and leaders. And then the same script keeps coming back in different ways because frankly, how else will you unite a people who are so particular, so anchored in their geographies, in their particular landscapes, with their lives and occupations, relationships centering in that space? That's at one level. And then how do you unite caste society? That's a huge challenge because, again, to quote Ambedkar, the caste order is built on negativity. No, it's graded inequality. As he very memorably said, no man is brother to another. So the only unity caste society is capable of is a negative unity, which means that you need an outside element that you can demonize and hate and horribly and sadly, it has been the Muslim so far. And that script can change a bit. It can become the Christian in some parts of the country. And the Dalit is a perpetual outsider whom they will claim is actually an insider who can be brought in, but they'll never bring him or her in. So it's a very, very interesting script which they have kept going. This is their strategy. This is also the strategy of Brahmanical thought. So one can't disconnect the two. Hindutva is very much a very sort of renewable kind of idea which bases itself on the contours of Brahmanical thought. And by this, I mean not something that I'm using in a kind of a ideological way saying that is bad, I'm just using it in a descriptive way that you can think of this as a way of thinking about the world, which I think serves these authoritarian forces very well. Because if you don't admit of change and dissidence, and you constantly seek to accommodate something, basically you're saying whatever is there is already the best, no? And whatever is there is what we tell you is there, which is Sanatan. It's always there. It's such a circular argument. So how do you puncture this circular argument? Only by completely negating it and taking a position outside of it. And which is why they fear Islam. Because Islam completely sort of challenges every one of those premises. Christianity, they are not sure what to do. With Dalits, they are anxious. And that I think is our strength. Because somewhere they don't want to come across as being completely and violently anti-Dalit. So green branch, olive branch in some directions, trying to say, yeah, Ambedkar said this, he's actually sort of supporting us. That's what that Outlook interview had pointed out. Ambedkar did not agree to this Aryan-Dravidian mix. Very, very clever, just to pick out one aspect of Ambedkar's thought. So they do this all the time. And of course, where you find them completely sort of unwilling to move is on the gender question. Basically, they're quite unwilling to sort of look beyond the role of women except as reproducers of caste and community. That they are very clear. So, on the whole, I think their strength is also this endless repetition of time-worn banalities and the menace that they bring to it and the way they can make it mean different things at different times. And I think we need to latch on to that and not get aggrieved each time, because when we get aggrieved, they love it because they think that we are right. It's all these horrible secularists and so on. But if you have to tell them, look, you bore me, this is stupid, you've got nothing new to add, nothing new to say, they don't quite know what to say to you. And that's not the tone we take with them, right? We are arguing with them on their own terms. But their own terms are so limited and so banal. And it's completely lacking in imagination, intelligence, all of that.
I was thinking when you were talking about this whole circular banality, how we also stuck in the circular banality, right? Like sometimes I wish I was just reporting other things, like we were doing, but we're always so stuck because this keeps coming back. It's either a love jihad or it is somebody wanting to free a temple.
They're so active. What do you do? I mean, they are the most
Yeah,
active
The
activist
most
group
active
right
social group at this point of
No, but
social
when she was
force, I
talking, I was
suppose.
just thinking we are stuck in the circular banality more than them because every time we can say, okay, we'll ignore, but you only keep saying that we have to record everything for posterity, and this whole exercise of recording for posterity, we are just stuck in that circle, right? Yeah.
now. But elections, Danya.
Elections,
No, just once, but before we go into the elections, one small thing I just want to add. This is something I've been thinking about also, because it's not that anyone feels particularly great thinking about them, right? I mean, we all feel despair and anger and so much else. But I personally, I can say this about myself at least, that I also think dialectically, okay? I mean, I was raised in the old school Marxist tradition after all. So basically, I see that the same set of developments which have brought these guys into focus and power has also seen some other fantastic developments in the subcontinent. It has seen an assertion of Bahujan Dalit voices. It has seen women writing and seeing things in different ways. It has seen queer people really challenging their ideas about gender and sexuality. But the challenge is how to make those things speak and sort of subvert Hindutva. It's not easy all the time. But if one were to also think of these things, and while recording for posterity and not letting posterity forget that some monstrous things happened in the mid-20th, in the first decades of the 21st century and after. But if the counter story is also narrated in parallel in some ways, you also see that there is possibility, And I see that possibility in young people. I see that possibility in the classroom. I see it, for instance, I was in a workshop in an academic context, and I had 80 students, and all of them, almost 80% to 90% of first generation PhD scholars from different parts of India, and the acute questioning that they had about things, their earnestness in wanting to understand, which is very rare in most educational institutions today. And it is highly sort of rewarding to be with such students and to think and ask questions along with them. So all I'm saying is that I completely see your point about how we are also getting lost in the circular loop, because one way is to, from time to time, push the circle aside and then see these other things. And then, of course, come back to dismantling that circle in whatever ways we can. I mean, we can't let it be the way it is. But at the same time, there are other things that can push us forward in unexpected directions. We don't know yet. So
before we complete, I have to tell our audience that Sudipto has been going on talking about when I went reporting to Madurai. So that article is going to be out on, I think we have a schedule, Sudipto, which is on the 5th of November. On the 5th of November, which is a Wednesday, we'll put that article out. Or I think the 3rd of November, one of those days. So please do read it. It's a long story, and it's going to be in 2 parts, right? It's about the Ayodhya of the South. So the article will come. Yes, Sudipto, your point?
Nothing. You can't stop me when I'm on the verge of I'm overwhelmed with emotion at your scholarship, at your expertise, both Geeta and you. How you understand that state. So many times in the course of whatever you said,
I don't think you can compare me to her, but yes.
No, but as a journalist and a scholar and separated by decades.
But you're running one of the nicest things that's happened to Indian journalism, please. Danya, we're very glad you're there.
Yeah, you are.
That I agree.
Yeah. She is, therefore we are.
Yes.
She is, therefore we are. But thank you so much for the...
And I mean, it's like, what the South? The South is suddenly there. It was never there.
No, ma'am, and also your scholarship and, the kind of, I don't know if it's bipartisan or how it is, but there is so much in what you say which is clearly not taking sides and just putting things out there and, for us to see, as opposed to, you telling us how to see. The way you arrange those facts, and I think they become self-evident. So thank you so much for what you do. I just feel very grateful for you being around. And also the thing you talked about, right, that political education school, it reminded me of Gauri Lankesh. Danya, Anisha, you must remember, right? In those days, she used to get a lot of young journalists, activists, everyone around and do these.
I was too timid back then to do it. Go even near her. Like I would be like, Gauri Lankesh.
Yeah.
They used to run this thing called Column 9.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Column 9.